So let me turn it open to the audience. Who has a question?
Thank you for your wonderful speech and very informative. My name is Ping. I'm under KG's MR policy team. And I have a very simple question. How you adapt yourself into a new culture and how you Cantonese? Can you use Cantonese to interact with your patients?
Well, I don't see patients anymore, but the reason I had to learn Cantonese is because I was seeing patients in Queen Mary and then in the Lin Hap Museum where people didn't speak English. So it was a necessity born of actually working at the time. But I think I personally have been very fortunate for a number of reasons, because I've worked with all the countries in this region. I've 3 times recently been to North Korea, for example, working with the government there on tobacco control. And in general, I think I've been quite well accepted by governments as an advisor. And I think there's several reasons for this. One is that I am British. If I had been a Malaysian doctor, I doubt that the Chinese government would have invited me somehow to go and advise them. Secondly, I think being a woman has also helped, because especially for some governments in the early days, that was seen as much less threatening. They didn't know about my Viking genes. For example, I remember the Ministry of Health in Mongolia in 1990, and this was the very year the Russians left Mongolia, having ruled it for the previous 80 years just about. He said they were very relieved. I was the first non-Russian advisor ever to go to Mongolia in 1990. And I remember him saying, first of all, they thought I might be a CIA spy, country wrong and all that, but because I wasn't interested, they got a nice little school program to show me. And he said to me, when I went later in 1992, he said you weren't interested in this. All you wanted to know was about tax and borders, and what was the security on borders about cigarette smuggling coming through, and how many people worked in the tobacco industry. And you know, these were sort of state secrets. But I said, and what conclusion did you come to? And he said, no, we came to the conclusion you were not a CIA agent. But he said I was much more acceptable because I was a sort of woman in those days. Thirdly, I am based in Hong Kong, which was seen to be rather politically neutral as well in Asia. I wasn't representing a particular government, it was a colonial government at the time. So I think and also when I work with governments, I never, ever, ever tell them what to do. I listen to what their problems are and what they want to do, and I just say to them, well, what do you think the next steps are? And then I will say, well, in Hong Kong, our government's done this. In Singapore, they've done that. You know, do you think this is possible? It's a dialogue. It's never, some advisors I've seen go into Asian countries from the West in particular, and somehow almost dictate what should be done. And that should is not a word in my vocabulary. So I think that's really helped. You know, just working with governments. And I've been really privileged in being really able to do that. So I think the way forward is in terms of just almost a sort of negotiation and a, you know, genuine respect for the country. I mean, one example of that is that if a government does do something really well, you will find everybody takes credit. The NGOs take credit, the government takes credit, WHO takes credit, everybody takes credit for it. And recently in Shanghai, last year, they went completely smoke-free. They have a law that is better than our law, because the one reason is that in bars and restaurants, they don't just find the smoker, they find the manager and the owner. And that means it works, which it doesn't work as well here. This is what we really have got to try and do. Anyhow, they put through a really, really good law, and everybody took credit. And I was a lone voice, I can tell you, in the international community saying, well, actually, it's a Shanghai Municipal Authority, the city authority that really has the first credit for doing this. They are the ones that really got it through. We might have funded, we might have assisted, we might have done this and that, but it's fundamentally the place itself that has actually done that. And I think, I'm talking now about political advocacy and political lobbying, but to me this is not difficult. To me this is just, you know, human relations, to tell the truth. And I think if you are working in tobacco control, this is the way you need to go. I'm not quite so polite with the tobacco industry, I might say, but I don't often meet with them.
Yeah. We have a microphone.
Thank you, Judith. On economics and government policies in terms of taxation, you know, Hong Kong has removed our tax on alcohol. So would you advocate, Sophie there to take this up? Because I guess that is sort of the important aspect that we need to address now, alcohol.
Yes, we had a previous financial secretary who was a wine lover who took off the tax on alcohol. That was seen as a very retrograde step by the international public health community. And we know, interestingly enough, we know how, well, if you want to, I was saying, if you want to do tobacco control, you have a job for life, you have to understand economics. I was once at a forum where there were 6 experts all sitting in a row, and they were asked, if you had one thing to do in tobacco control, what would that be? One said tax, the next said tax, the next said tax, right down the road, tax, tax, tax. And it seems very strange to people who are not working in public health that it should be a fiscal measure that actually reduces tobacco use. But it is, and it's as simple as making these products unaffordable to kids. If you can get children till their frontal lobes are fully developed at the age of 23 and they can make long-term sensible decisions, you can see it on MRI scans. 23 is when we can actually, our frontal lobes are fully developed and we can make long-term decisions. So if you can get kids to 23 without smoking, it's very unlikely. We haven't found a country in the world where the average age of starting smoking is over 20. So we need to actually protect, in the very best sense of that word, these children. And tax is the way to do it. Of course, we need all the other things. We need what Koch is doing with all its public education campaigns. We need the smoke-free areas. We need the advance. We need all of those things. But taxation is the core. And coming back to alcohol, it looks as if that's exactly the same with alcohol. And this is why some countries are introducing minimum pricing to try and prevent that sort of youth smoking. So I would think that tobacco, of all our non-communicable diseases, has actually, in a sense, almost led the way. Because I guess, 30, 40 years ago, we realized that the industry and the way it behaved and economics was the key. People asked me in 1984 when I left clinical medicine, what is it you need in Asia? Because I was very much on my own, as you will remember in those days. I said, I need a health economist. That's what I need, a health economist, to try and do the various studies on that. So I think that we do need to address the economic impact, and I think that pricing on alcohol is a really, really important issue. And I think taking off the tax was not a good step for Hong Kong, I have to say.
I think we have a question back here, then here, then here.
Hi, Professor. My name is Tanya Mason. I'm a third-year PhD student. So I have 2 questions for you. The first question is, have you done any work with the Japanese government? And if so, can you tell us a bit more as to why the smoking rates in Japan are higher than Asian countries such as Hong Kong?
The Japanese government, interestingly enough, Japan, Singapore and Hong Kong are the 3 places in Asia that have halved their male smoking rates over the last 30, 40 years. We have always said that this would never happen unless there was political will. This was the key, political will of government, to make this happen. And yet somehow Japan is one country in the world which doesn't fit that model. It doesn't, because there is not that real commitment like there is in Hong Kong and Singapore, the other 2 places. And so what has happened in Japan is it's an alternative route. You get all sorts of things here and there. The railways go smoke-free. This shopping mall goes smoke-free. This street goes smoke-free. Everything is sort of happening in a rather disjointed, almost kind of way. I had some discussion about this last month with the regional director of WHO, the new one, who is from Japan. And he said that the government is working behind the scenes to make things happen. Well, we'll see. But we have to remember that until very recently, the Japanese government owned Japan Tobacco. Just as the Chinese government owns the China Tobacco. In fact, the biggest tobacco company in the world is the Chinese government. It's bigger than Philip Morris, it's bigger than BAT. The biggest tobacco company in the world is the Chinese government. So when we're talking about industry, there is an additional complication here as to how you tackle it when the industry is part of the government itself and what effect that has. That's a whole other basic discussion. But Japan, I think there's a lot of very good tobacco control advocates there. There are a lot of people doing a lot of good research in Japan, and bit by bit, in a funny sort of patchwork, quilt kind of way almost, things are sort of coming together without there being a real central leadership at the moment. Having said that, the Japanese government have just announced that their 2020 Olympics are going to be smoke-free, and boy, was that a battle to actually make that happen. But this is what they've just announced. So maybe there is a sort of movement, whether it's by osmosis from countries around it, whether it's the naming and shaming, whether it's the influence of organisations like WHO, who have certainly been in touch with the Japanese government about this. But every country has its challenges. Japan is certainly not alone in this. Every country has its challenges. And we here in Hong Kong, one of our biggest challenges is that we are the home to some very big, powerful tobacco companies based here and trying to influence our policy here, which makes it really difficult for government to do the right thing.
Thanks. Hi Judith, this is James Ockenden. I think we've had a few
Yes.
emails back and forth on some of these topics.
Indeed, yes.
So good to see you again. My question is on the prevalence, which people say is a very good thing in Hong Kong, and we're very much congratulated for it. But as I put to you before, we just don't see that translating on the street. Where I live on Bonham Road, the research I've done, we see a smoker going by in the morning, every 15 seconds, every 30 seconds. And that's a lot of smokers going by, that's a lot of secondhand smoke. And we see smokers in the children's playground there, we see them in all of the non-smoking areas. With respect to Professor Chan and her department, TACO is not particularly doing a very good job of stemming that. And so when I hear congratulations, I feel quite irritated, to be honest, when I see what's actually happening on the street and what my babies, my two, age 1 and 3, have to actually breathe in. One thing that I mentioned to you by email was about the Greater Bay Area and about the regional issue and the mainland Chinese visitors. We have 6 million or so a month coming, and there's a very high percentage of those who smoke. You had indicated to me that that because it was a different region, it was actually difficult to compare or do any sort of work across the boundary. I think.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't say it would be not difficult to work. I said that there are 3 different jurisdictions involved. There's a Hong Kong government, a Macau government, and then there's a government from China, and they were very different in terms. No, I'm sure Sophia's department already is collaborating with, the Ministry of Health in China. It would be very wrong if it were not. There's collaboration there, but in terms of, for example, legislation and regulation, it would be very difficult to impose that with 3 different jurisdictions involved.
Yeah.
As a common policy, I think. Maybe I'm not thinking far enough into the future, but I think at the moment, each one has its own jurisdiction. And, in terms of enforcement, I would say that every single country in the world has problems with enforcement. Of the smoke-free laws, the advertising laws are pretty well enforced. The pack warnings are pretty well enforced. The difficulty of enforcement are the smoke-free areas. And one of our fundamental problems is that our law here does not penalise the owners and managers, and therefore, in bars and restaurants and places, they have no incentive to try and stop people smoking in them if they don't wish to. That's a very big gap, and at least I've been hoping to try and fill that for, ever since 2007. And all it would require is the liquor licensing board to have an edict and to actually do it. But it simply isn't happening, and I feel it should be. That and taxation are the 2 things that I think will take us forward. But I think that, the statistics that have been done since 1982, and they've been done very regularly, and they do show a dramatic downward trend. If you were here in the 1980s, people were smoking everywhere. They were smoking in all public transport, in all theatres and cinemas and ferries and lifts and shopping malls and offices. You name it. That has actually gone from Hong Kong. So I think we have to claim some credit. I think Hong Kong deserves some credit for being probably, along with Singapore, these are the 2 best places in Asia if you want to live as a non-smoker. And yes, there are people still smoking outdoors and things like that. But, if you compare it to, as I said, other epidemics, we're in for the long haul, and we're certainly not there yet. But if you see smoking in bars and restaurants and places like that, I mean, we need a good reporting system.
No, I see it. I've developed my own automatic system now where I can send an email to TACA with a location and a date and a time and a latitude and longitude.
And actually in Beijing, they've also got a very good law, and they also, I've spent a lot of time in China in the last few years trying to say, please don't do your smoke-free law like ours. Please get the managers and owners so that they're responsible too. And Beijing and Shenzhen and Shanghai have all done that. But in Beijing, they have this wonderful wall as wide as this room, it's almost like flight control place. And people can WhatsApp in and say, take photographs, and it goes to a central place, and they can track where people are smoking. In Macau, if you go to Macau, you will get an SMS message saying you're coming into Macau. We have a no smoking policy, you can't smoke in all of these places. We need to get our Hong Kong Telecom people just to do that automatically. There's things we still can do and still do need to do. Actually, that's a very easy one to do, and Macau's already doing it very, very easily. Just to tell people, tourists or people re-entering, what have you, to remind them of what the legislation is. But the smoke-free area enforcement is actually one of the most difficult. And in fact, the party school in China has recently brought out a big manifesto on smoking. It actually published it just before Xi Jinping became the president. He was head of the party school, and it came out under his jurisdiction. And the one concern they had was, how do we police these laws? Is it a volunteer force? Should we ask for volunteers? Is it the police? Is it a tobacco control office like we have in Hong Kong and represented here today? Is it the hygiene inspectors who go after rats, those people? Are they the people who should be monitoring these kind of things? This is difficult for every government, in all honesty. It's not that I'm unreservedly supporting what's happened in Hong Kong, because we do have some problems. But I think we've done pretty well, actually, I do.
I think probably Professor Lam.
Just a very quick question. We now have something very urgent here. The government bill to ban the e-cigarette produced tobacco products. And then we have a few committee now has called for the application. All right, so may I ask you, at the moment, shall we target the industry or target the legislators and lobby them to endorse and vote for the government's bill, please?
I think with e-cigarettes, just putting this in a nutshell, is that I think the government carrying out its policy address was to ban e-cigarettes, heat not burn, and new tobacco products. At the moment, the law is that if you have an e-cigarette apparatus that does not have nicotine in its capsule, it is legal. If it has nicotine, it is not. So what is happening is that nicotine is coming in over the border from China illegally, and we need to clarify the situation here. The fundamental questions with e-cigarettes are two. One is, do they encourage young people to start smoking, to start vaping, and then go on to smoking or continue vaping? And secondly, do they help smokers quit? Or do they actually keep smokers smoking in a sense of sort of security, thinking, well, I'm vaping or half vaping, it's probably safer. Now, the answer to these two questions will not be definite for about another 2 or 3 years. We've got studies that are being done, I have to say, not in Asia, so that's yet another uncertainty. They're being done mostly in North America and in Europe, and we don't know. We have uncertainty. We have uncertainty as to what's in them. The e-cigarettes, there's about 800 different varieties of them, and they've got all sorts of things in them, and nobody really knows what these are. And some of them are additives, some of them are flavorings, some of these chemicals are dangerous themselves. There's no kind of regulation of these products, so we don't know what's in them, we don't know their effect on children yet, and we don't know whether they really help smokers or not. America has allowed a bit of a free-for-all. Public Health England, in the very early days, came up and said they were 95% safer, to the surprise of many people. Now, if you take stick by stick, then probably e-cigarettes, probably, because we don't know, but probably those e-cigarettes are not as harmful. I wouldn't say safer, but they're not as harmful. But it's not that, it's the social science that we don't know. We don't know if they will renormalize smoking. They're very trendy, they're very attractive, all these sort of little plastic things, embedded by, I might say, with software. I don't think many people realize that, but these these things that they use to smoke e-cigarettes are embedded with software that has all sorts of potential in terms of, tracking people and stuff like that. And then I've just brought with me, I mean, these are the kinds of advertisements that have surfaced in America for e-cigarettes. I mean, can you imagine? And this one is called Back to School. I mean, when they say that they're not actually interested at all in recruiting young people. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Hong Kong would face. So just as with the 737 MAX, this is a really, really good example. The 737 Boeing MAX, we do not know what the problems were that these two planes came down. There is uncertainty. Nobody knows whether they're safe or whether they're not safe. And they did the right thing. They did a precautionary principle of banning them and grounding them until such time as it's clear where the problem is. And it's exactly the same with e-cigarettes. We actually need to adopt what WHO recommends as a precautionary principle to actually, Hong Kong should not be an experimental playground for the tobacco industry to launch these products. And by the way, once you get them out on the market, you will never get them back in again. It will be almost impossible to do. People who know me know I have come extremely reluctantly to this conclusion. If there was any product that could actually help smokers and save lives, I would be in the front line actually up there endorsing it. But I've come very reluctantly, but very definitely to feel that the government is right. It has to keep these products out until we have better evidence, and Hong Kong should not be the experiment for that. We will find out in another 2 or 3 years the first level of information about them in the UK in particular. But actually, we also have got long-term effects, and it took 50 years on the introduction of the cigarette machine until in the 1900s, until 1950, when we realised how dangerous cigarettes were. It takes a very long time to understand risk and danger. And I think, as I said, we should adopt this precautionary principle. I've come really right round to feeling that this is the best way forward for Hong Kong. Sophie will be pleased to hear. But it's not that I started off against the tobacco industry. And also, having said that, we have been misled twice before. The first time was with the filter cigarettes. The tobacco industry promised us a safer cigarette. The second time happened with the low-tar cigarettes. They said these are safer cigarettes, if not safe. I mean, that was how they were really marketing. And this now is a third time we're being presented with what is ostensibly a safer product. So I think, knowing the tobacco industry, we have to have a very healthy level of scepticism about this. So I think we need to support the government. And every medical association just about in Hong Kong has. The Teachers Association here a Parent Teachers Association did quite a big survey last year. 82% of parents do not want these products on the market in Hong Kong. They don't want their children to be used. It's a sort of an experimental place for introducing them. So I think that really for the moment, I'd also advocate reviewing this law in 2 years' time. We will have a bit better idea where the world is at in 2 years as to just. What we don't want is to add on another epidemic on top of tobacco, especially when we've been so relatively successful in bringing the tobacco epidemic down. Sophie, do you want to add something?
Thank you, Judith. Not so much about the e-cigarette. I think you have said it all. And thank you all for your support on the government's bill on e-cigarette. We have just had the first Bills Committee meeting, and there are lots of potential for the legislators to filibuster. Because if they know that they can't get anywhere, the strategy is to filibuster. So anyway, I think the society's support is very important. I have one question for you. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for your contribution, not only in tobacco control, but in the overall public health advancement in Hong Kong, because tobacco is really, although it is only one of the 4 modifiable risk factors for NCD, that is the most important, has the highest risk in getting these NCDs. Secondly, you have rightly pointed out in your words of wisdom the political advocacy, the importance of political advocacy, and not only in education. while we know education is important, the individual behavior change is important in all these NCD risk factors. But then the world has changed, and the industry's lobbying is very fierce. And so therefore, my question is, with all the existing organizations or bodies in traditionally doing education campaigns per se, what would be your advice? For example, the Hong Kong Council on Smoking and Health, our Central Health Education Unit, and many other perhaps NGOs that is actually doing health education for people. Would there be a role change, or at least some role change in being political advocacy? Changing is almost like a social movement, because if you have to move the legislators and they respond, to the people, because most of them are, unless those are functional constituency representatives, they are responsible for the people, in Hong Kong. They listen, to the people. So therefore, how would you see the changing role of these, traditionally education units? That what additional work that they should be doing in terms of political advocacy, social movement, and what skills should people acquire, in doing this, because it is not easy, for people who are traditionally, running education campaigns and doing health education, publishing pamphlets and so on, to change, their role in becoming political advocates.
I would suggest just two things. I think firstly with young people, they can understand very well the manipulation of their behaviour by an industry, and they don't like it. And I think Kosh has already done some kind of campaigns along those lines. That, you're almost like puppets on a string. You're being manipulated by an industry. And that, when young people understand the way that industry has behaved and they've intervened, teenagers are very capable of understanding this. If you say to them, you're going to have a stroke at 70, or you'll have a heart attack at 85, it's sort of meaningless. So with young people, I think, you basically help them to understand the political and engage in that debate. Also with young people, one thing I have found is that if you talk to them about the problems, for example, of smoking right now, how, a lad of 15 in the audience, your sperm, as we speak, is being affected by tobacco. I mean, put it on the line. You're laying down all your cardiovascular risk factors and hardening the margin. This happens in the teenage years. The genetic changes are happening in the teenage years when people are starting smoking. And of course, the sports ability and stuff like that. But what is happening to you now, plus the understanding of the industry? And I think in general, the health organisations could and should be much more political in supporting government legislation. I think that, I lectured a group of public health students at another university that shall be nameless recently, and I said to them, all very carefully listening to the lecture, I said, what have any of you done in terms of lobbying for public health in Hong Kong? And they haven't actually done anything. So it's not just listening to lectures and absorbing it. People need, before the budgets, collectively, we need to be supporting a tax increase or minimum pricing for alcohol or whatever. They need to be politicised in terms of their thinking and their lobbying, because I think that kind of advocacy, whether it's to the public, whether it's to the sufferers, and we mustn't forget them, they're often a bit neglected in NCDs actually, the people who are actually the sufferers of cancer and things, but to both, the legislators and so on. I think these organisations have got to change from talking about health risks to really starting supporting the legislation that we know will bring these epidemics down, and I think collectively. And also understanding the economics. If I might just say one last thing, one of the most useful economic surveys I have ever come across was done by Professor Virginia Lee, who's in the University of California. She's now into her mid-90s. What did she do? She went up to Yunnan, the heart of tobacco in China, to UC, And she managed to persuade the government for 4 years to switch farmers out of growing tobacco. And so 458 farming families changed, not to build buildings or roads, but to grow something else. So they switched them all over, and the income over those 4 years went up between 21 to 110%, depending on what they were doing. This study, this economic study, and this is where I think, again, public health people have got to do much more of this. This is worth its weight in gold in China. It means that economically the government doesn't feel it needs to protect its farmers, look after them. They can't manage without tobacco. It's these kind of, and the trade treaties as well. I mean, public health MPH students should be encouraged to actually investigate and write about these trade treaties and work out what can we do about them. Because Hong Kong signed a bunch of trade treaties before 1997, and some of them are terrible. New Zealand was really the only country that insisted on putting in a clause saying that that trade, if it was not detrimental to public health. The rest of them just don't even mention it, and the new treaties are even worse. So I think as a university, there's an absolutely open area for research into the behaviour of industry and really what it's doing. I mean, it's a field wide open, I would think, just thinking about it now.
I think if the secretary asks a question, it's the last question. So with that, first can we thank Judith for a fantastic effort.